A thick, milky, white fog enveloped the fields of Picardy early on the morning of March 21, 1918. This was not merely a natural phenomenon, but an ominous curtain, concealing the largest concentration of military force the world had ever seen. In the trenches of the British Fifth Army, stretched along the forward positions near the city of Saint-Quentin, an unnatural, almost ringing silence reigned. Soldiers, chilled by the dampness and cold, peered into the impenetrable gloom, trying to discern the outlines of no man's land, but visibility did not exceed 10 meters. They did not know that at that very moment, just a few hundred steps from them, tens of thousands of German stormtroopers, the elite of the Kaiser's army, had already taken their initial positions, clutching grenades and sharply sharpened entrenching tools, awaiting the signal for the beginning of the end of the old world. The air was permeated with moisture and fear, that animal sense of danger that arises when instincts cry out about trouble before the mind comprehends it. British sentries heard strange sounds, muffled clatter of metal, creaking wheels, distant voices distorted by the fog. But the command assured them that the enemy was not ready for a major offensive. This was a fatal delusion. Behind the veil of fog lay the last hope of the German Empire, an operation designed to break the back of the Entente with one crushing blow. Saint-Quentin, an ancient city with a rich history, became the geographical point where the fate of the entire war, and with it, the future of Europe, was to be decided. The situation that had developed by the spring of that year resembled a string stretched to its limit, ready to snap at any second. Germany was in the grip of a naval blockade. The population suffered from hunger, and resources were depleting at an alarming rate. The entry of the United States of America into the conflict changed the balance of power. Every day, fresh battalions, full of energy and unfamiliar with the horrors of trench life, arrived across the Atlantic. The German General Staff, led by Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and his brain trust, Erich Ludendorff, understood one simple and cruel truth: time was working against them. They needed a victory here and now, before American power became insurmountable. The section of the front near Saint-Quentin was chosen not by chance. Here, the French and British armies met, and the junction of two different commands, two different logistical systems, and national characters is always the most vulnerable point of any defense. The strategic plan was simple and brilliant in its cruelty. Strike at the point of connection, break the link between the Allies, push the British to the sea and the French to Paris. If this plan had succeeded, Britain would have been forced to evacuate its forces, as would later happen at Dunkirk, but 20 years earlier, and France would have been left alone with the German Colossus. At 4:40 in the morning, the silence was shattered by an inhuman roar. Over 6,000 German guns simultaneously opened fire. This was not just an artillery preparation to which they had become accustomed over years of positional warfare. This was a symphony of destruction, conducted by Colonel Georg Bruchmüller, a genius of artillery nicknamed Breakthrough Müller. He developed new tactics. Instead of plowing the ground for days, warning the enemy of the direction of the strike, the fire was short, but with incredible intensity, sweeping away command posts, communication nodes, and enemy artillery batteries. Shells fell with mathematical precision, but the most terrifying thing was not the explosives, but the chemistry. Bruchmüller used a complex mixture of poisonous gases. First came shells marked Blue Cross, irritants that forced British soldiers to tear off their gas masks due to unbearable vomiting and sneezing. These were followed by Green Cross shells with lethal gas, which affected unprotected lungs. This cocktail turned the front lines and rear of the Fifth Army into hell on earth, where people suffocated in their own trenches, unable even to send a distress signal as telephone wires were cut in the first minutes of the shelling. The chaos that reigned in the British ranks cannot be described in ordinary words. The defense system, built over years, collapsed in a matter of hours. Commanders on the ground were blinded and deafened. They received no orders from headquarters, and messengers sent with reports disappeared in the fiery barrage and poisonous fog. General Hubert Gough, commander of the Fifth Army, found himself in a tragic position. His troops were stretched over too wide a front, reserves were insufficient, and promised reinforcements from the French were delayed. Gough understood that his army was becoming a sacrifice offered on the altar of strategic miscalculations by the High Command, which had too long ignored warnings about the concentration of enemy forces. When the artillery barrage began to shift deep into the British defenses, they appeared from the fog, the stormtroopers. This was a new breed of soldiers forged by war. They did not advance in dense chains as in 14, presenting themselves as ideal targets for machine guns. No, they moved in small groups, infiltrating through gaps in the defense, bypassing resistance nodes like water flowing through fingers. Armed with light machine guns, flamethrowers, and bags of grenades, they appeared where they were least expected, in the rear, at artillery positions, at command dugouts. The psychological effect of this tactic was devastating. British soldiers, accustomed to the enemy always being in front, suddenly found the Germans already behind them. The feeling of encirclement caused panic that spread faster than a wildfire. Strong points that could have held for hours surrendered without a fight because the defenders lost faith in the possibility of resistance. Saint-Quentin, a key transportation hub, was threatened with capture by the end of the first day. Roads leading west filled with crowds of retreating troops, mixed with refugees, carts, and abandoned equipment. But beneath the outward facade of Germany's military triumph lay a deep internal fracture. The German soldier of 1918 was a formidable fighter, but he was hungry, literally. Years of blockade had exhausted not only the civilian population, but also the army. When stormtroopers captured British warehouses full of canned goods, white bread, cheese, and wine, discipline began to crack. The offensive slowed not only due to enemy resistance, but also because the victors stopped to eat their fill for the first time in many months. This paradox, a hungry army defeating a well-fed one but losing momentum due to captured food, became one of the hidden reasons why a grand tactical success did not translate into a strategic victory. Internal conflict also tore apart the Allied camp. A dangerous tension arose between British Field Marshal Douglas Haig and French General Henri-Philippe Pétain. Haig demanded support, fearing his army would be pushed to the English Channel. Pétain, seeing the collapse of the British defense at Saint-Quentin, began to prepare to withdraw his troops to defend Paris. This moment, when each commander began to think only of saving his national army, could have been fatal for the Entente. The alliance was cracking exactly where Ludendorff had planned. The ideological confrontation reached its climax during these days. It was a battle of two concepts of war. On one side, the old school of positional defense based on trench lines and the belief that artillery conquers, infantry occupies. On the other, the birth of a new type of maneuver warfare, where the initiative of junior commanders, speed, and surprise mattered more than the thickness of concrete walls. The German infiltration tactic, later carefully studied in military academies in Poland, Russia, and around the world, showed that even the most powerful line of defense could be breached by affecting not the stones, but the nerves of the defenders. The transformation of the situation did not occur on the battlefield, but in the mayor's office of the small town of Doullens, where Allied leaders gathered on March 26th. The atmosphere was heated to the limit. The faces of the generals expressed an extreme degree of exhaustion and anxiety. It was here, in the face of imminent catastrophe, that the decision was made to create a unified command under the French general Ferdinand Foch. In the face of complete defeat, national ambitions receded into the background. Foch, a man of iron will and an aggressive style of warfare, uttered his famous phrase, quote, "Zero." This spirit of determination slowly began to seep down into the trenches, where the remnants of the Fifth Army and the arriving French divisions tried to cling to every inch of land. The culmination of the Battle of Saint-Quentin and the subsequent offensive came in early April. The German war machine, which had made an incredible 60-kilometer dash, began to bog down. Logistics could not keep up with the stormtroopers. Artillery lagged behind, stuck in craters on the churned-up fields of the Somme, those very fields that had been devastated in previous years of the war. The land, transformed into a lunar landscape, exacted its revenge on its conquerors, preventing the delivery of ammunition and provisions. German losses were colossal. Elite assault units, the spearhead, were worn down in continuous battles. Poorly trained teenagers, unable to maintain the pace of the offensive, replaced the fallen veterans. At the same time, Allied resistance intensified. The arrival of French reserves and fresh Australian and Canadian divisions created an insurmountable wall on the way to the vital railway hub in Amiens. The last desperate German attacks drowned in blood. Operation Michael, which began as a triumph at Saint-Quentin, ended in a strategic stalemate. Germany gained vast territory, but it was "one the captured territory was destroyed, held no strategic value, and only lengthened the front line, which now had to be defended by fewer soldiers." The resonance of these events echoed through history. The Battle of Saint-Quentin became a bitter lesson for all participants. For Britain, it was the tragedy of the Fifth Army, the memory of which remained a painful topic for a long time. Thousands of soldiers, whose bodies were never found, became part of the Picardy soil, turning into silent witnesses of human madness. France, having suffered enormous losses while saving its ally, once again confirmed its self-sacrifice. But this sacrifice depleted the nation's demographic resources for decades to come. However, from a military perspective, the lessons of Saint-Quentin were invaluable. Soviet military theorists in the 20s and 30s, analyzing the experience of German stormtroopers, developed the theory of deep operations. They understood that breaking through the tactical defense zone was only the beginning, and that success must be developed by mobile formations deep into enemy territory. Polish military strategists also closely studied the effectiveness of maneuver groups, understanding that in a future war, static defense lines would become the grave for armies. In fact, it was in the muddy trenches near Saint-Quentin that the principles of blitzkrieg were born, which would again shake Europe 20 years later. The world that saw the dawn after the battle changed irreversibly. The illusion that war could be static and predictable dissipated with the morning mist of March 21st. It became clear that modern conflict is a competition not only of soldierly valor, but also of industrial might, logistics, and management technologies. The battle showed that even the greatest tactical skill and personal heroism cannot compensate for the lack of strategic resources and political unity. The end of hundreds of thousands of lives on the fields near Saint-Quentin did not lead to an immediate end of the war, but it started the countdown for the German Empire. Having spent its last best reserves in this grandiose gamble, Germany was left defenseless in the face of Entente counterattacks, which would begin in the summer of the same year. The city of Saint-Quentin, ruined and devastated, became a symbol not only of destruction, but also of the limit of human capabilities. When we look at these events today, more than 100 years later, we are struck not only by the scale of the tragedy, but also by the cyclical nature of history. How technology changes tactics, how political disunity threatens the existence of nations, and how the fates of millions depend on the decisions of a handful of people in closed offices. All this remains relevant in our time. The lessons of Saint-Quentin remind us of the fragility of peace, and that behind every line on the map, behind every date in a history textbook, there are living people, their fear, their hope, and their final choice. Thus, the fog that enveloped the fields of Picardy that March morning dissipated. But the shadow of those events continues to lie on European history. The Battle of Saint-Quentin remains a monumental reminder of the moment when the old world finally collapsed, giving way to a brutal, dynamic, and uncompromising modernity. And in the silence of military cemeteries, where former enemies lie side by side, one can hear a silent call to remember not only strategy and tactics, but also the price humanity pays for its ambitions. The battle, which began with the deafening roar of thousands of cannons, ultimately led to silence. But it was the silence of exhaustion, the silence before a new storm that would define the contours of the 20th century. The story of Saint-Quentin is the story of how a single point on the map can become a center of gravity for colossal forces that ground up destinies and empires, leaving behind only memory and lessons that we are obligated to learn. Analyzing those events now, one cannot help but notice the paradoxical role of technologies. Gas, artillery, aviation, which began to play an increasingly prominent role, supporting ground troops with assault strikes. All this created a new reality. Man became vulnerable as never before, but at the same time, more depended on the individual actions of a single soldier, capable of stopping a breakthrough or, conversely, capturing a key machine gun, than in the era of mass formations. This dualism, the insignificance of man in the face of the war machine, and the greatness of the human spirit capable of resisting this machine, is the main philosophical outcome of the battle. It is interesting to trace how the perception of time changed during the battle. For generals in headquarters, time was measured in days and divisions. For a soldier in a trench, time compressed to seconds between the whistle of a shell and an explosion, to heartbeats when he saw the figure of an enemy emerging from the smoke. This stratification of time created a gap in the understanding of what was happening. While Ludendorff looked at the map and saw arrows pointing to Paris, the German infantrymen saw only mud, blood, and endless fatigue. This gap between strategic design and tactical reality became one of the reasons why Germany lost. They won the battle on maps, but lost it in the reality of human capabilities. Ultimately, Saint-Quentin became not just a battleground, but a turning point in the evolution of military art. The transition from positional stalemate to maneuver warfare required a complete restructuring of the military's mindset. Officers had to learn to make decisions in conditions of absent communication, take responsibility, act autonomously. This was the school that future commanders of World War II passed through. Rommel, Manstein, Guderian. Many of them, as young officers, absorbed the experience of assault groups precisely on the fields of France in the spring of 18. And this experience, transformed and amplified by new technologies, they would apply 2 decades later. Thus, the echo of the cannonade near Saint-Quentin resonates through the decades. It sounds as a warning that tactical success not supported by strategic vision and a resource base, leads to catastrophe. It reminds us that the morale of an army directly depends on the state of its rear. And finally, it tells us that in any war, there comes a moment when quantity turns into quality, and inertia of thought becomes the most dangerous enemy. The memory of those days, preserved in memorials and archives, serves as an eternal reminder of the line beyond which ambition turns into a tragedy of universal scale.